you very much, Susan, and always a pleasure to come to these lunches. I've been enjoying them throughout the entire academic year. It's been a great experience, learning a lot of different perspectives on topics that we're all interested in. So we're going to be talking about today, this is a paper, and I presented a early precursor version of this about, I don't even know, a year ago or something like that. And so this is work with Aaliyah, who's sitting right here, Estelle, who's sitting right there, and Federico, who is 1,500 miles away in Dallas, Texas. And what I was going to do is I'm just going to give you a 5-minute overview of where this project started and what we're trying to do. And then Aaliyah is going to come in and give more of the background of where the paper is actually going right now. This is in some sense, the second paper that we're working on in the background of it. And then Estelle is going to walk through the final part in terms of the primary findings. And so where we started, we're accountants. And so in our world, the world kind of circles on this notion of how do we do reporting and how do you organize information and do it in a way that makes sense, that's reliable, that you can base decisions on. The challenge is that we understand very well in the ESG space that these types of constructs have a lot of measurement error. There's a lot of noise regarding them and a lot of bias. Sometimes those two move hand in hand. The noisier measure, the easier it is for management, whatever incentives, to come in and to start infusing bias to move a number in a direction that would prefer. And so because of that, it came to us that it makes sense to maybe think about things different, like alternative approaches, if you will, to how to get data and evaluate data. That moved us to think about textual analysis. A lot of the disclosures and information that we care about in the ESG space are qualitative in nature. There are quantitative things, carbon emissions, things of that sort. But a lot of the other types of disclosures lend themselves to having a qualitative characteristic. And so what we started doing is going into how to think about textual analysis as a way to understand ESG and ESG related risks. And so the approach that we used was to look at the SASB Materiality Map. That's kind of as a starting point, almost an anchor point for thinking about topics that are probably most material to companies. And then we try to assess it and relate it to companies and their 10Ks, which are the annual required filings in the United States. And the risk factors section is a particular section in the 10K where companies are required to disclose all material risks within that section. So the regulator basically says, if you face this risk, you got to put it in here. The nice thing about using this is that it avoids a lot of self-selection problems that we talk about in other channels. So if you think about disclosures like a CSR report, the problem is management can choose what to include and what to exclude. In the risk factors section, that's not supposed to be the case. You are supposed to explicitly include it in that if the company faces it. This is a little piece of the materiality map. Aaliyah is going to talk more about that in a minute. All I want to highlight for those of you that may not be familiar with it, SASB is the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, and so they came out with basically a heat map about industries going down in 77 columns here, and ESG categories going in 26 rows here. So each cell denotes a topic for a particular industry. What they basically did is they came up with a heat map, and what you can see is the dark cells. Those are the ones where the SASB says, this is a topic, and if you're in this industry, you should be reporting on it. It's recommendation. SASB is voluntary. It's not a regulator. It's voluntary. What we did in our initial project is we basically asked the question, all right, to what extent are firms consistent or inconsistent with what the SASB is recommending? That was our initial question. And what we basically found after going through that first iteration of the paper were the following. A couple of interesting things. First, we found that firms do not disclose many topics that the SASB recommends as material. Kind of interesting. Second, we found that firms are disclosing a lot of ESG-related risks, even though the SASB doesn't indicate them as being material for these firms, conditional on being in the industry. And the third and maybe most telling piece was the variation that we observed. Absolutely incredible variation across industry, variation across firms, even variation across time in how firms are complying with the SASB recommendation. And so what we're doing now in this next version of the paper is now what we want to do is expand it. Ooh, good. That's good. Very good. Thank you, Susan. So the next piece is to now think about, can we expand this? Our benchmark in our first iteration was benchmark to the SASB, and what SASB is recommending. Since we saw so much variation, and it raised a lot of questions for us in terms of why aren't companies following what SASB is recommending? Because quite honestly, to the SASB's credit, their process for how to identify material topics seemed pretty thorough. They elicited a lot of feedback from industry practitioners, industry and investors, and it was a little surprising. That led us to maybe let's think about what industry is actually doing as an alternative benchmark, and then we can compare and contrast. That's where we are right now. Enter Leah, who's going to tell you about where we're going with this project.
Andy has given an introduction about our paper, and it has evolved a lot. So the main question that we ask in our paper is whether these type of disclosures are consistent with SASB or industry best practice actually predict future negative from specific ESG outcomes. And at high level, we can think about this as the effect of ESG disclosures on future penalties and incidents related to the ESG. So the global risk landscape has been changing, and according to World Economic Forum report, we can see that there is a shift from mostly economic risks to environmental, which are green, and social, which are red. And according to the recent report, these risks, social and environmental, are going to persist in the future as well. So which means all the companies are exposed to environmental and social risks. And for stakeholders, including investors, it is important to understand the changing risk profile of the company. However, we all know that ESG area has some issues with measurement of the ESG disclosures and activities. So we have various methodologies. We don't have precise metrics, which leads to lack of comparability, both across companies and across years. The good thing is that there are some quasi-regulators which help companies to provide disclosures. And one of them is a Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, which is called SASB and was established in 2011.
You want like a sauce in it or on the side to dip it in? A difference between these are, for example.
Part of IFRS Foundation, and for our setting, we combine SASB with 10K risk factor disclosure. So the uniqueness of SASB is that despite it provides voluntary guidelines for companies, it mostly focuses on industries and it focuses on financial immaterial. Whereas 10K disclosures are mandated. So they are mandated SEC disclosures. SASB provides a user-friendly product, which is called SASB Materiality Map, where we can see this matrix of combinations of material and immaterial items for different industries. It has 5 main dimensions, including ESG parts, and which then are subdivided into 26 ESG categories, which are more focused dimensions. And then we have 77 industries. As you can see, we have blue cells and white cells there. Blue cells are for material items. It means that this item is financially material for this industry, and companies within that industry could disclose this item. So for agricultural products, greenhouse gas emissions is the material. Whereas white items for commercial banks, white cells are immaterial items. Overall, each industry will have a different number and combination of material and immaterial items, which leads us to 2002 cells of industries and factories. As an example, we can see at agricultural products industry, and SASB recommends 7 out of 26 ESG categories to be disclosed by companies within this industry. So they are dispersed in terms of different dimensions, and every industry will have different combinations. The second element of our setting is 10K is factor section, and the good thing that it is SEC mandated, which means that we can overcome greenwashing issues because it's audited as well. We firms must disclose all material risks, so there is no self-selection issue with these disclosures, and exclusion of any of the material risks will lead to litigation and litigation going forward. The one important thing as well is that SASB materiality concept is very similar to the SEC materiality. So now when we have our two elements, when we combine them, we can see that we can have the 10K disclosures over there, and we have some material SASB items and some immaterial SASB items. If SASB identifies one of the ESG categories as material and company discloses it, this contributes to our consistency measure. It means that the company follows SASB recommendation. On the other hand, if SASB thinks that the issue is immaterial, but company still discloses the item, it contributes to the inconsistency. So again, if you go back to our question, we are interested now how ESG is part of disclosures that are both consistent and inconsistent with SASB predicting negative ESG outcomes. And to answer this question, we actually need the consistency and inconsistency measures, which we derive from the textual analysis. So now I want to walk you through our process of derivation of our main measures. We again will focus on agricultural products industry, as well as we can see. There is one dimension, social capital, which we will focus for now, and only one ESG category, which is material for the industry, which is product quality and safety. So basically what we need is we need to create a dictionary and then map it to 10K this part of disclosures. SASB Materiality Map provides a short description for each of the ESG categories, and basically it's 1 or 2 paragraphs, and they represent a shorter version of SASB standards. So we read through these descriptions and created a list of keywords. They are both single and multiple token words. And then we parse 10K list factor section, and we map the list factor based on the keywords to the material and immaterial item. So if the item is considered as financially material and is disclosed, it's consistent measure, and vice versa, if let's say the company would provide some disclosure or risk factors related to assessment of vulnerability, but SASB thinks it's immaterial, it will be inconsistency. So to create our consistency value measure, we calculate the percentage of total material and disclosed items, and we divide it by total material SASB items for the industry that company operates with. Again, as an example, we know that for agricultural companies, we have 7 material items, but if the company only discloses 3 of them, it leads up to 43% of this. What will we do with the immaterial items? If SASB thinks that it is immaterial, but company still discloses it, we count these instances and divide it by total immaterial items. For this example, if we had 7 material items, it means that 26 minus 7, the industry and companies there have 19 immaterial items. And if the company decides to provide 5 disclosures out of them, it's 26% inconsistency. That is how we create the consistency and inconsistency measures for our final data. So as Eddie has mentioned, we had very interesting results in terms of companies do provide many inconsistent disclosures. So they do not follow SASB 100%, but on the other hand, they provide more disclosures that are inconsistent. So we saw that maybe market clears itself. So maybe industry has their own perception of what is material for themselves, for the companies inside the industry, and we decided to create a similar materiality map, but based on the industry best practice. Okay. So to do so, we choose for each industry year, we choose 5 largest companies based on size, and then if 3 or more of these companies disclose a specific ESG category, then we consider this as material. And then if not, if like 1 or 2 companies disclose, it's immaterial. Then we do the same procedure in terms of calculating consistency industry and inconsistency industry. We just change our materiality map to industry-based materiality map.
And now as well, please through some charts and some main results we have. So first of all, what we are looking at here, we're showing some descriptive evidence for the SASB measures we have in mind. what you're looking at on the left here, we're simply plotting the number of total material category per SASB map. So if you look at the red one, what it shows is that out of the 26 category per SASB map, overall 6 of them are considered as material. Okay? And then out of the 26 category per map, 20 categories are considered immaterial. As you can see, those numbers are stable over time because the SASB material categories do not change over time. It's like a static map, right? And then in terms of what the company is doing, so on the right panel here, we simply plot the level of consistent and inconsistent disclosure over time by our sample firms. So as what you're looking at here, there appears to be an increasing trend for companies to disclose consistently with SASB map. That's the red line. But at the same time, we also see there's an increasing trend for companies to disclose inconsistently with the SASB map, right? So in the right panel, I think there are 2 additional takeaways we want to highlight here. So first of all, if you look at the red one, it's kind of somewhat surprising that the percentage is actually not at I wouldn't think it would be at 100%, but it's actually much lower than the 100%. What that means is that a lot of SASB, a lot of ESG categories that are considered material by SASB are not actually reported by firm. So if you think about in a perfect world, all companies disclose all material categories for SASB, you will think this number should close to 100%, but that's not what we're seeing here. Our data suggests that the mean value is about 50%. And what that means? That means that about 50% of categories that are deemed material by SASB are not mentioned in company's 10K report at all. And then now, so that's the true chart based on the measure based on the SASB map. And then the next one I want to show you is what about the we redefine, we calculate activity by using the industry best practice as the benchmark. So on the left panel here, once again, we simply plot the total material category defined by the industry leaders. Okay, so if you focus on the red one, the red bar, you see that there's increasing trend suggesting that the number of material category defined by industry practice actually has increased over time. Not just the increasing trend, another thing we find is interesting that the numbers are higher. So if you calculate the mean for the red bar, it's about 11. So out of 26 categories, about 11 of them are considered material by industry leaders. Whereas if you go back to the prior slide, based on the SASB idea of what materiality is, about 6 out of the 26 are considered material by them. So we definitely see industry identify more category as a material, which is not the case with SASB. And then if you see on the right-hand side, that's what we want to see, what company actually are reporting. So we do see a clear separation here. If you look at the red line, that shows that the company are currently reporting more consistently with the industry guideline. The 70% over there suggests that about 70% of the category that are considered material by industry got disclosed by firm. And the 20%, the blue line down there suggests about 20% of the category that are deemed immaterial by industry are disclosed by the firm. So if you remember from the prior slide, we don't see much gap in following the SASB map. However, here it seems that we see a much clearer. That's exactly what we expect to see. That you report consistently with the guidance, and for the inconsistent one, you report less of that. To summarize our main statistics here, so in the paper we developed 4 variables: the consistent data, the inconsistent data, the consistent and inconsistent. So for example, if you look at the consistent end, basically that captures the percentage of consistent disclosure per SASB. And we show that the mean value is about 0.49. That suggests that 49% of the ESG category deemed material by SASB got disclosed at firm. At the same time, 40% of the ESG category that are deemed immaterial by SASB are also disclosed. For the industry here, about 70% of the category that are deemed material by industry were disclosed, and about 20% of the category that were immaterial by industry practice were disclosed by firm. So So overall, I think the main takeaway here, it seems that companies are disclosing more consistently with the industry best practice as opposed to the SASB. So the other thing I want to highlight, so now we have ESG categories that are considered material by SASB. We also come up with our own ESG categories that are considered material by the industry. So the question in mind, do they overlap? They are two completely different things. So the good answer is they do overlap. However, each of them has their unique components as well. So here I want to use the agricultural product industry as an example. So as you can see, there are 26 categories here. In the middle column here, we highlight the material category per SASB. So briefly, there are 7 of them. And then if you look at the material category, we identified following the industry best practice, there are about 11 of them. So some of them do overlap. For example, the first one, greenhouse gas emission, water managed. So those categories are considered material under both definitions we have, whereas you can also see there are unique components. Some components are just unique for the SASB definition, and there are also other components that are considered material by the industry, but not by SASB. All right, so we have 4 hypotheses in the paper, but they're all intended to answer our main research question, that is, to what extent our disclosure measure helps predict a negative ESG outcome, right? So for the H1B, we predict that the risk disclosure consistent with SASB should positively predict the future negative ESG outcome. So the idea we have in mind is that we know SASB follow a very detailed process to come up with a material category. The assumption is that if the SASB did a good job in identifying those risk category, and then the disclosure of those risk categories should positively help you identify or positively predict the future negative ESG outcome. That's kind of the prediction we have. And then the second prediction we have is that we think the inconsistent disclosure may help. Well, you can't even, in the beginning, we thought the inconsistent disclosure may be a bad sign. The other way, if you think about the inconsistent disclosure, is that when SASB identified the material category, they focus on the average material risk an industry has. However, if you think about a firm-specific ESG risk a company has, they may not capture by SASB at all. So we think that depending on company's individual situation they have, there may be some ESG risks that are specific to the company, but are not common for the industry in general. Those categories will be captured in our inconsistent measure as opposed to the consistent one. But we think as long as companies disclose categories that they think are material to their firm, whether that's going to say that's material or not, as long as they disclose those kind of things, they should help predict a future negative outcome for that firm. So that's why we think that inconsistent disclosure may not be a bad thing. It just reflects the unique ESG risk the company has, which are not considered by the SASB map. And then in the H2, we have a similar prediction, but now we're not benchmarking our materiality based on the SASB map. Instead, we do benchmarking based on the industry best practice. But our prediction is the same. That is, if your disclosure are consistent with the industry best practice, then that's going to help with the predicting future negative outcome. And similarly, even though your disclosure are not consistent with the industry best practice, but if you believe that's a specific risk just for your firm, then your disclosure could potentially be helpful as well. So in terms of data, we collect our data from various sources. Our sample period goes from 2005 to 2018, and we basically focus on all US traded, the US public listed companies with available data we need to use. For the ESG outcome variables, we had 2 of them. The first one is the number of ESG penalties. So the ESG penalty data we get from the validation tracker. So briefly, that is a pretty comprehensive database that collects penalty data for more than 500,000 criminal and civil cases. So we basically, for per firm year basis, we just count how many penalties that company has in that particular year. And then the second variable, number of ESG incidents, we obtain that data from the RedRisk, which is another data provider. So RedRisk use machine learning and AI to identify and quantify a risk, ESG risk exposure based by a firm. So basically, on a daily basis, that company monitors the ESG news or ESG incidents through like social media, Twitter, government release. So all kinds of online sources you can think about. So they keep track of all of them and then to code how many incidents a company has seen on daily basis. Okay, and then we run a pretty standard OLS model here. So our outcome variable on the left-hand side, that's the future penalty or future ESG incident company may have on the T+1. And on the right-hand side, that's the predictors we have, which is the core disclosure variable we have in mind. In the first model here, we have consistent SASB and inconsistent SASB. So if you look at the beta one, so to the extent that the disclosure that is consistent with SASB helps predict future negative outcome, we would expect a positive beta one. And similarly, to the extent that the disclosure inconsistent with SASB helps predict the future negative outcome, we would expect a positive beta two. So we have a similar model for the consistent and inconsistent measure benchmark with industry best practice, but the predictions are the same. So let me just quickly show you the main result we have here. So as you can see, we have 6 columns here. The first 3 columns focus on the penalty as the outcome, and the right 3 columns shows the incident. But the results are pretty consistent across the 2 outcomes. Let's focus on the first and the left panel here. So in column 1, before we jump into the consistent and inconsistent stuff, we want to get a basic idea in terms of, in general, whether ESG risk disclosure help predict a future negative outcome. So in column 1, instead of having consist and inconsist, we basically do a simple count of the number of material category. Actually, take that. We do a simple count of the number of categories out of 26 that were mentioned by the firm. We don't care whether they're material, they're not. Okay? So as long as you mention 10 category out of 26, we don't care whether they're material or not. That's reflected in column 1. So the basic idea we want to see is that overall, if you look at the ESG risk disclosure in aggregate, whether that helps with predicting a future negative outcome. And then we do show that higher ESG risk disclosure in aggregate helps positively predict a future negative outcome. And then in column 2, that's where we start to introduce our main consistent SASB and inconsistent SASB variables. Very interestingly, as we can see that the only significant predictor we see is actually inconsistent SASB. What that means is that it is actually the disclosure of ESG categories that are deemed immaterial by SASB help predict a future negative outcome. The results are not significant for the consistent SASB. And then if we move on to the third column right here, where we focus on the consistent in and inconsistent in. Idea is the same, which variable wins out. And it seems that it is a disclosure of ESG categories that are consistent with industry best practice. Right there, help predict a future negative outcome. And the inconsistent in does not flow. So overall, it seems that in terms of predicting a future negative outcome like future penalty, it seems that the strongest predictability variable comes from the ESG topics or ESG categories that are consistent with the industry practice, but are not within what SASB think are the material ones. So it seems that the main takeaway of the paper is to suggest that the industry component is really important here. So we did an additional decomposition analysis to really help support the main results we have. So what we did here, as I show you in the prior slide, the SASB consistent and the industry consistent measure the category, they do overlap, right? So now what we do is we kind of decompose our consistent and inconsistent measure into 4 components. The first component is the one in green. Basically, we specifically identify the categories that are considered material by both SASB and the industry, right? And then the second component we have is the ESG categories that are just considered material by the industry. And the third component, which is the red one, they are the ESG category that are just considered material by SASB. And there's a fourth component, which is not shown here, that will be the remaining category that are neither material by SASB nor material by the industry. Okay, so and then what we do is we have 4 variables and then we run the 4 variables in the same regression at the same time to see which variable wins out. And among the 4 variables, the only significant variable we were able to find out is actually the industry unique component that significantly predict a future ESG negative outcome. So that's kind of support our main result that is really something unique about the industry materiality map that helps predict those left tail outcome. All right, so to summarize here, I think we have like 3 main takeaways for this paper. The first one, we kind of developed 2 new measures to assess how consistent or inconsistent company risk disclosure are aligned with the material categories. And we define materiality in 2 ways. One follows the SASB map, and the other one follows the industry best practice. And then after developing those 2 new measures, we can provide some descriptive evidence to show that these firms do not disclose all of the SASB material categories. And what is even more surprising is that firms are actually disclosing many categories that are immaterial by SASB. And then finally, since we have the industry best practice measures, we show that companies' disclosure are more aligned with the industry best practice. And then finally, the third takeaway of our paper, when it comes to predictive lifestyle events like a future penalty and a future ESG in an instant, it seems that the strongest determinant of the strongest predictability comes from the ESG topics that are more consistent with the industry best practice and not consistent with society. Right, so let's